I never believed in aliens until one stood at the foot of my bed and spoke the name. My mother whispered over me in a woman name I've never told another living soul. It was 3 hours past midnight when I woke to a light that didn't behave like light should. A radiance that seemed to breathe, pulsing soft and golden like a heartbeat made. Visible in the darkness of my room, my body locked in place, not from fear alone, but from something deeper. A recognition that trembled in my bones as though my soul remembered this presence. From before I was born, the figure stood impossibly still, neither male nor female, wrapped in what looked like folded starlight, and though it had no mouth, that moved. I heard my name echo inside my skull with such tenderness that tears began streaming down my frozen face. Every rational thought I'd ever armed myself with dissolved in that moment. Every argument I'd prepared against the impossible crumbled like sand castles before a wave I couldn't see but felt rushing through every cell of my being. The air itself seemed to thicken with something I can only describe as concentrated peace. Yet underneath that peace ran a current of such raw power that my heart hammered against my ribs. Like a prisoner begging for mercy, I wanted to scream, to run, to hide beneath my blankets like a child. But I also wanted to fall to my knees, to worship, to weep with a gratitude I didn't yet understand. This was not the cartoon alien of movies and jokes, not the cold probe of conspiracy theories, but something ancient and holy that looked at me with eyes that held galaxies and somehow, impossibly, knew everything I'd ever hidden from myself. The room felt both infinitely small and vast as a cathedral, and I understood in that moment why the angels in Scripture always began with "fear not," because the presence of the divine, even filtered through a messenger, is too much for human flesh to hold without shattering. Time seemed to bend and slow, each second stretching like honey, and though I couldn't move, I felt my consciousness expanding, reaching toward this being even as every instinct screamed that I was in the presence of something that could unmake me with a thought. Then it spoke again, not my name this time, but a single phrase that would unravel everything I thought I knew about God, about creation, about the very fabric of reality itself. I have traveled farther than your science can measure to find you, because you are ready, and because time is running short for your kind to remember what you truly are. The words didn't come through my ears, but seemed to materialize directly in my mind, each syllable carrying weight and warmth, resonating in a frequency that made my chest ache with inexplicable longing. I found my voice then, barely a whisper, cracked and small in the luminous presence that filled my bedroom with impossible grace. And I asked the only question my terrified, awestruck mind could form. What are you? The being shifted, and though it didn't smile, I'm not sure it had a face in the way we understand faces. I felt its kindness wash over me like summer rain, gentle and renewing, patient with my fear. I am a messenger, it said, and suddenly the space between us seemed to thin, as though the being was simultaneously at the foot of my bed and standing right before me, close enough that I could feel warmth radiating from its luminous form. I am one of many sent by the One who spoke existence into being, sent to find those whose hearts are still open, whose spirits can still hear truth beneath the noise of your frightened world. My mind raced through every religious text I'd ever read, every late-night debate about God and aliens, faith and science, wondering how they could coexist, wondering if I'd lost my mind or found something that would finally make sense of the longing I'd carried my whole life. You've been taught to see us as separate from your God, the being continued, and now I could feel something like sorrow in its voice, ancient and deep as oceans, but we have always been his servants, his hands in the cosmos, witnesses to the love that holds every atom in its place. The light around it intensified, and I had to close my eyes, but even through my eyelids I could see it, burning gentle and relentless, and I knew with absolute certainty that my life had just split into two categories, before this moment, and everything that would come after. What I am about to show you, the being said, and now I felt it moving closer though I kept my eyes squeezed shut, will challenge everything you think you know, but it will also confirm what your soul has always whispered to you. In the quiet moments when you dared to wonder if there was more, I felt something approach my face, a presence of pure energy hovering inches from my skin, and every hair on my body stood on end as though I'd become a lightning rod for the divine. Do not be afraid, it whispered, echoing words spoken by angels to shepherds, to Mary, to every human who'd ever stood on the threshold of encounter with the holy and trembled before its terrible beauty. What you are about to receive has been given to prophets and mystics throughout your history, to those who would become bridges between heaven and earth, And now you join their number. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart a wild drum. My body shaking not just with fear, but with anticipation. With a hunger I didn't know I possessed to see what lay beyond the veil of this ordinary world. Open your eyes, it commanded gently, and against every instinct of self-preservation, I obeyed, looking up into a face made of light and compassion, into eyes that held the beginning and the end, and I knew I was about to see what I was made for. Then it touched my forehead with what might have been a hand or might have been pure consciousness, taking form, and the universe exploded open behind my eyes, and I was no longer in my bedroom but standing in the moment before moments began, in the presence of a love so vast it had no choice but to create. Time lost all meaning as I hung suspended in that space between nothing and everything, and I understood why the being had come, why I had been chosen to witness and to tell. The truth waiting to be revealed wasn't meant to destroy my faith, but to expand it beyond the small boxes I'd built, to show me that God's love story with creation was far stranger, far more beautiful, and infinitely more intentional than I'd ever imagined. As the vision began to unfold, as I felt myself pulled backward through the corridors of cosmic history, I heard the being's voice one more time, soft as a prayer. Watch now and remember, and when you return, tell them what you saw, that they are loved, that they are known, that every atom of their being is held together by the same force that birthed the stars. My last coherent thought before the revelation consumed me completely was a simple, desperate prayer. God, let me survive what I'm about to see, and let me find words worthy of carrying it back. Then there was only light and truth, and the sound of a voice speaking existence into being, and I was witness to the moment when nothing became everything, when silence became song, when loneliness became love made manifest across a billion galaxies. What I saw in that eternal instant would take me the rest of my life to fully understand, but in that moment, suspended between the being's touch and the birth of creation, I knew I would never be the same, and I knew I would spend every remaining breath trying to share this impossible, beautiful truth. I stood in the void before creation, though stood isn't the right word because I had no body, no form, only awareness floating in an infinite darkness that somehow didn't feel empty but pregnant with possibility, thick with intention, alive with a presence so immense that to call it God felt both perfectly accurate and utterly inadequate for what I was experiencing. The being's consciousness wrapped around mine like a protective membrane, allowing me to witness what no human eyes were meant to see, without being obliterated by the sheer magnitude of it. And I felt its voice not speaking but existing alongside my thoughts, guiding me through the impossible. Vision unfolding in every direction at once. Before there was time, it said, and I could feel the weight of each word settling into my understanding, like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through my entire sense of reality. There was only one, only love, only an infinite consciousness that had always been and would always be, complete in itself yet choosing, deliberately choosing, to create because love by its very nature must give, must share, must multiply itself. I wanted to ask how I could be seeing this, how my finite mind could possibly contain even a fraction of what was being revealed, but the questions dissolved before I could form them because I was being shown the answer in a language older than words, written directly onto my soul, round me, or perhaps within me. I began to sense movement in the darkness, not physical movement, but something stirring in the fabric of potential itself, and I understood I was witnessing the moment when God, alone in the eternal silence, made the choice that would birth everything. The presence I felt was so personal, so intimate, yet simultaneously so vast that galaxies would one day be dust motes in its awareness. And I wept without eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that this cosmic force knew me, had always known me, had thought of me before the first star ignited. Watch, the being whispered, and I felt its joy mixed with reverence, the joy of a servant who has witnessed this truth countless times yet never grows tired of its beauty. Watch what love does when it decides to no longer be alone. The darkness began to hum with something I can only describe as divine anticipation, and I felt rather than saw the presence gathering itself, concentrating its infinite nature into a single point of intention. And I understood with shocking clarity that what I was about to witness wasn't some cold mechanical event, but an act of profound intimacy. God choosing vulnerability, choosing to pour itself out into creation. The being's consciousness tightened around mine, bracing me, preparing me, and I felt its thoughts bleeding into my own. Your scientists will one day call this the Big Bang, and measure its echoes across the cosmos, and they will be right in everything they observe. But what their instruments cannot capture is the love that ignited it, the purpose that shaped it, the consciousness that spoke it into existence with a word that contained every word that would ever be spoken. I wanted to protest that faith and science had always been at war, that I'd spent years trying to choose between them, building walls in my mind to keep them separate. But even as the objection formed, it crumbled because I was being shown that the division was false, a tragic misunderstanding to languages describing the same miraculous truth. Then it happened, and happened is too small a word, too pale a description for what I witnessed. The present spoke, or sang, or exhaled, and reality exploded into being with a violence that was somehow also the gentlest caress, light erupting from nothing, space and time, unfurling like a flower that had always been folded inside God's heart, waiting for this precise moment to bloom. The sound of it, if sound is even the right word for what I experienced, was music and mathematics unified, beauty and precision wedded in perfect harmony. And I heard in that cosmic symphony every song that would ever be written, every prayer that would ever be whispered, every cry of joy and pain that would echo through human history. I was sobbing now in whatever form I occupied in this vision, undone by the sheer intentionality of it, by the care woven into every unfolding dimension, by the love that didn't just create randomly but designed, planned, hoped for what would come. And the being held my consciousness steady as I shook with the revelation. "Do you see?" it asked, and its voice carried both triumph and tenderness. The satisfaction of a teacher watching a student finally grasp a truth they've struggled toward for years. "Do you see that there is no war between faith and knowledge, only between those who see with half sight and those who dare to open their eyes completely?" The universe rushed outward from that initial moment of creation, and I rushed with it, watching as energy cooled into matter, as particles found each other in the expanding darkness, as the first atoms formed according to laws that weren't arbitrary, but were expressions of God's character made mathematical, divine personality translated into physics. Time was moving strangely around me, millions of years passing in what felt like heartbeats, and I watched galaxies swirl into existence like paint colors mixing on an infinite canvas, each one unique, each one somehow necessary to the pattern the Creator had envisioned. Before the first moment began, the being's presence remained constant beside me, anchoring me to sanity as I witnessed epochs of cosmic history unfold. And I understood that it had seen all of this before, had perhaps been present at creation itself. One of the first thoughts God had when deciding not to be alone, a servant fashioned to witness, and to serve and to carry messages between the infinite and the finite. We were there. It confirmed, responding to my unspoken realization. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy, we were there, not as creators but as the first creation, fashioned to be His hands in the cosmos, to tend the garden that would grow to galaxy-sized proportions. I thought of angels and suddenly understood they were more real and more strange than any religious painting had ever captured. Beings of pure purpose who moved through dimensions we couldn't perceive, doing work we couldn't imagine, all in service to the love that had birthed them and everything else. I watched as the universe cooled and expanded, as stars were born and died and were born again from the ashes of their ancestors. And through it all I felt the presence of intentionality, of a consciousness that hadn't simply wound up a clock and walked away, but remained intimately involved in every moment, every development, guiding without controlling, loving without forcing, present in ways we'd built entire theologies trying to understand. The being spoke again, and now its voice carried something like urgency, as though this next part of the revelation was crucial, the hinge on which my entire understanding would turn. "Watch now as we come to your world, as the garden receives its gardeners, as the story becomes personal in ways that will one day break your heart and heal it in the same breath." Suddenly we were moving, or perhaps the vision was moving around us, and I felt myself being drawn toward a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable star in an ordinary galaxy, one planet among billions, and yet as we approached I felt the attention of the Creator focus on it like a spotlight, like a parent bending down to examine something precious their child had made. And I understood I was about to witness something that would connect everything I'd just seen to my own existence in ways that would shatter and remake me. The being's consciousness wrapped tighter around mine, protective and excited, preparing me for the next revelation. And I felt its love for this small planet, its investment in what was about to unfold there. And I knew without being told That this was the moment when the cosmic became personal, when the vast clockwork of creation narrowed its focus to produce something that could love the Creator back, something made in the divine image, something that would one day include me here. The being whispered, and its voice trembled with emotion I hadn't heard before, all mixed with something almost like fear, the reverent terror of a servant watching their master take a risk that could end in glory or tragedy. Here is where everything changes, where the universe that began with a word prepares to receive the word made flesh. But first, you must see how we prepare the way. The being's hand reached toward my forehead, and though it had no substance I could name, no flesh or bone in any human sense, I felt the touch as both physical and beyond physical, a contact that happened simultaneously in the room where my body lay frozen, and in some other realm, where my consciousness had been pulled free like a thread drawn from a tapestry. The instant its fingertips made contact with my skin, reality inverted, turning inside out in a way that should have destroyed my sanity, but instead clarified it, as though I'd been living my entire life looking through frosted glass that had suddenly been wiped clean, and I was no longer in my bedroom, but suspended in a place before place, a when before when, surrounded by something that was neither darkness nor light, but somehow the possibility of both. My mind screamed that this was impossible, that human consciousness couldn't survive what I was experiencing, yet here I was, held together by the being's presence like water held in cupped hands, and I understood that it was translating the vision into forms I could barely comprehend, dumbing down infinity so my finite mind wouldn't simply evaporate under the weight of what it was being shown. Be still, the being whispered, and its voice was inside me now, woven through my thoughts like golden thread through cloth. Be still and know that what you are about to witness is the most intimate secret of existence. The moment when love decided it would rather risk everything than remain alone in its perfection. I floated in the void, and the void was not empty, but full, pregnant with an awareness so total and complete that calling it God felt both exactly right and hopelessly inadequate, like calling the ocean wet or the sun bright. Technically true, but missing the overwhelming reality of the thing itself. This presence didn't occupy space because space didn't exist yet, didn't move through time because time was still a dream in its mind, and yet it was utterly, devastatingly alive, conscious in a way that made human consciousness look like a candle compared to a supernova. And I felt myself drowning in the recognition that this wasn't some abstract force or impersonal energy but a person, a being with intention and desire and love so fierce it would soon rip itself open to birth a universe. The being holding me in this vision spoke again, and now I could hear something like tears in its voice, the emotion of a witness who has seen this moment countless times across eons yet still finds itself moved to its core. Before anything was, he was, and he was complete, lacking nothing, perfect, in every conceivable way, needing no creation, no worship, no relationship outside himself, because within his own nature existed perfect love, perfect communion, perfect joy. I wanted to ask why then? Why create at all if perfection already existed? But the question was already being answered, shown to me rather than explained, and I watched as the presence began to move in ways I had no language for, gathering itself with deliberate intention, and I understood I was witnessing not necessity but choice, not lack but overflow, love so abundant it couldn't help but give itself away. The consciousness I was perceiving began to deliberate, though deliberate isn't quite right because it suggests time passing and uncertainty resolving, when what I actually witnessed was more like watching an artist's hand hovering over a blank canvas, pregnant with vision, trembling with the anticipation of making the invisible visible, the imagined real. I could feel the thoughts of the Creator, not as words, but as movements in the fabric of potential, considering the cost and the glory of what it was about to do, weighing the mathematics of free will, the terrible beautiful risk of making beings who could choose to love or reject love. And I saw that this wasn't a casual act, but a sacrifice contemplated, an opening of divine veins that would eventually lead to a cross on a forgotten hill in a backwater province of an empire that didn't exist yet. The being's consciousness pressed closer to mine, steadying me as the weight of understanding threatened to crush me flat. Do you see it now? Do you see that creation itself was the first crucifixion? The first moment when God chose vulnerability, chose to pour himself out, chose to risk his heart on creatures who would break it. Tears were streaming down my face back in the bedroom where my body lay paralyzed, and also streaming through whatever form I occupied. In this timeless space, and I was sobbing with the beauty and terror of it, with the realization that I wasn't witnessing some distant cosmic event but the most personal decision ever made, because in this moment before moments, God was already thinking of me, already knowing my name, already loving me enough to gamble everything. Then the decision crystallized, and I felt the shift in the infinite consciousness like a breath being drawn in preparation for a word that would shatter silence forever, and the being holding me whispered with reverence that bordered on worship, "Watch now as love speaks," as the word that was with God and was God prepares to break the perfect stillness, with a declaration so powerful that billions of years from now, scientists will still be measuring its echoes and calling it the beginning, never knowing hearing the voice of their Creator calling them into existence. The presence gathered itself into a single point of infinite density, all of its vast awareness focused into one intention, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was prayer and planning unified, that God was about to birth a universe where one day His own Son would walk as a man, where spirit would put on flesh, where the infinite would squeeze itself into the finite not once but twice, first in creation and later in incarnation, the same self-emptying love expressed in different keys. I could feel the love radiating from that concentrated point of divine intention, love that already encompassed every moment that would unfold from it, every star that would shine, every person who would live and wonder and reach toward the heavens asking if anyone was there, and the answer was being prepared. In this eternal instant, a yes so loud it would explode into galaxies, a declaration of love so intense it would burn in every atom, and I knew I was about to witness the beginning of everything, the moment when God's heart cracked open and spilled out reality itself. The point of infinite density hung suspended in the void like a held breath, and then it spoke. And the speaking was not sound because sound requires air and matter and time, none of which existed yet, but I heard it anyway with senses I didn't know I possessed, a resonance that bypassed my ears and struck directly into the core of whatever I was in this moment. Before moments, the word went forth, and the void responded like a lover to a call, and suddenly there was light, except light is too small a word for what erupted from that concentrated point of divine intention, an explosion of such magnitude that calling it big felt like calling an ocean a puddle, a detonation of pure creative force that sent space itself expanding in every direction at once, carrying within its rushing wave all the laws and constants and fine-tuned parameters that would eventually allow stars to form, planets to cool, life to emerge. I was screaming, I think, both in terror and in joy, watching creation birth itself in response to love's command, and the alien being held me steady as galaxies spun out like sparks from a cosmic forge, its voice gentle in the hurricane of Genesis. Your scientists call this the Big Bang, and they are not wrong, but they are seeing only half the truth, measuring the physical echo of a spiritual shout, tracing the afterglow of God's first word without recognizing whose voice spoke it. The energy pouring forth was not random, not chaotic, but encoded with intention in every photon and particle, mathematics and meaning woven together so seamlessly that studying one would eventually reveal the other, and I understood that science wasn't the enemy of faith, but its other language, another way of reading the same love letter God had written in fire and fusion across the canvas of space and time. The being turned my attention to the specific moment of ignition, zooming my consciousness somehow closer to that first instant, and I saw what no telescope could ever capture, the fingerprint of deliberation on the face of the explosion, the mark of will directing what appeared to be chaos into carefully orchestrated order. Look at the constants, the being urged, and suddenly I could perceive them, the gravitational constant, the speed of light, the mass of electrons, the strength of nuclear forces, each one calibrated with such precision that changing any value by even a fraction would result in a universe where stars couldn't form, where atoms would fly apart or collapse, where the chemistry of life would be impossible before it even began. My human mind reeled at the implications, understanding flooding in faster than I could process it, because this wasn't the signature of accident, but of engineering, not the random roll of cosmic dice, but the careful adjustment of divine dials. And the being's voice carried both sadness and hope as it spoke. Your philosophers argued for centuries whether God wound the clock or was the clock, whether he created and stepped back or remained intimately involved, never understanding that the question itself was false, because the universe isn't a clock at all but a song, and the singer is still singing it, his voice sustaining every vibration of every string in the quantum foam that underlies what you call reality, I thought of all the debates I'd heard, science versus religion, reason versus faith, materialists dismissing believers as superstitious and believers condemning scientists as blind, and I wanted to weep at the waste of it, at how much time we'd spent arguing over false dichotomies when the truth had been available all along to anyone willing to look at creation with both eyes open, seeing both the mechanism and the meaning, both the how and the why. The vision shifted, and now I was watching the first atoms form as the universe cooled, hydrogen and helium condensing out of the primordial fire, the simplest elements waiting in vast clouds for gravity to gather them into the first generation of stars, and the being's consciousness pressed against mine with fierce intensity, demanding I pay attention to what came next. This is where your sacred texts and your scientific texts tell the same story in different dialects, it said, and suddenly I was seeing double, my mind holding two images simultaneously, one of ancient Hebrew words being inscribed on parchment, the other of stellar nurseries collapsing under their own mass, and I heard the echo between them, the way Genesis spoke of formless void and darkness over the deep before God said, "Let there be light," the way cosmology spoke of the dark ages before the first stars ignited, both describing the same sequence of emergence from chaos to order, from darkness to light, from potential to actuality. The first stars burst into fusion, splitting the darkness with their blazing birth, and I understood this was God's fiat lux made manifest. Let there be light not as metaphor, but as literal divine command encoded into physics. The ignition of nuclear fire in the heart of collapsing gas clouds being the mechanism by which the intention became reality. And there was no contradiction because the scientific explanation didn't replace the theological one but fulfilled it, showing the elegance of a God who could speak worlds into existence by establishing laws that would naturally produce the desired result. I was sobbing again, overwhelmed by the beauty of it, by the realization that every star was a testament, every galaxy a sermon written in light and gravity, preaching the glory of their Maker to anyone with eyes to see and the humility to look. And the being held me gently as I shook with the force of understanding, whispering that this was only the beginning, that if creation itself was this saturated with divine love and intention, I should prepare myself for what came next. The alien's presence surrounded me like a warm ocean, and I felt it reaching deeper into my mind, preparing to show me something even more staggering. But first it paused, letting the weight of what I'd already witnessed settle into whatever part of me would carry it back to my ordinary life. The word your scriptures uses logos, it said softly, reverently, the word that was with God and was God, the word through which all things were made. And your ancient prophets understood something your modern world has forgotten, that word and reality are not separate things, that to speak truly is to create, that the universe itself is divine language made solid, every particle a syllable in an ongoing declaration of love. I thought of John's Gospel, of those opening verses I'd heard 1,000 times, without really hearing them. In the beginning was the Word, and suddenly they weren't poetry but physics, weren't metaphor but mechanism, the description of how an infinite consciousness could translate intention into matter, thought into thing, will into world, and the Big Bang wasn't contradicting Genesis but confirming it, both texts agreeing that everything began with God speaking, with divine word shattering silence, with light erupting into darkness at the command of love itself. The being's voice grew quieter, more intimate, as though sharing a secret too precious for loud proclamation. When your scientists trace the cosmic microwave background radiation, when they measure the afterglow of creation still echoing through space after billions of years, they are hearing the voice of God, the reverberation of that first word still vibrating in the foundations of existence. And if they knew how to listen, really listen, they would fall to their knees in worship at what their instruments are telling them. I floated in the vision, cradled by truth too large for my small life, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same, that I would return to my body carrying an impossible burden and an unshakable joy, the knowledge that every equation describing the universe's birth was also a hymn, and every hymn celebrating creation was also accurate science, and God was far more glorious than either religion or reason alone had ever suspected. The vision shifted again, but this time the vastness contracted, the cosmic scale narrowing down through layers of space and time until I found myself hovering above a younger Earth, a planet I barely recognized, its surface still cooling from violent birth, oceans churning with storms that had raged for millions of years beneath skies thick with clouds that had never known sunlight, The alien's presence drew closer to me, almost protective now, as though what I was about to witness required special care in the seeing, and its voice came soft but urgent, carrying a reverence that made my borrowed breath catch in my throat. "Watch now," it whispered, "and understand that your Creator is not a God of accidents or abandonment, but of careful tending, of patient gardening, of love that plants across epochs your mind can barely comprehend." And then I saw them, descending through the atmosphere like falling stars that didn't burn, ships or beings or something between the two, creatures of light and purpose whose very presence made the air shimmer with holiness. And I knew without being told that these were the ones my ancient texts had called watchers, the appointed guardians, the celestial gardeners sent by God himself to prepare the soil of earth for the harvest he had dreamed since before creation began. They moved across the primordial landscape with deliberate grace, these ancient servants of the Most High, and I watched in awe as they worked not against the laws of nature but through them, guiding rather than forcing, nurturing rather than commanding, their presence accelerating what might have taken eons into merely millions of years, always respecting the framework of chemistry and biology that God had embedded into creation's fabric. I saw them hovering over thermal vents in the deep ocean, where the first complex molecules were forming, not creating life from nothing because that power belonged to God alone, but shepherding the process, protecting the fragile chains of amino acids, encouraging the dance of elements that would eventually lead to the first cell, the first spark of biological existence on this prepared world. The being beside me spoke without breaking my concentration on the vision, its words adding context to what my expanded awareness was witnessing. "Your scientists debate whether life emerged by chance or by design, never considering that God's design includes the mechanisms they call chance, that the Creator is so magnificent he can encode purpose into probability itself, that these watchers were not violating natural law but serving it, being the hands and eyes of divine intention working within the very system God established." I thought of all the arguments I'd heard about evolution, believers seeing it as enemy to faith and scientists seeing faith as enemy to truth, and I wanted to shout at both sides that they were looking at the same miracle from different angles, that God was brilliant enough to create a universe where life could emerge through natural processes he designed, guided by servants he appointed, the whole magnificent system a testament to his patience and artistry. Time accelerated in the vision, and I watched those celestial gardeners tending earth through age after age, present but hidden, guiding but not controlling, as single cells became complex organisms, as life crawled from ocean to land, as the great dance of evolution unfolded exactly as both the fossil record and the divine plan intended it to unfold. The alien's emotions bled into mine, and I felt the pride and tenderness these watchers had for their sacred task, the way they celebrated each emergence of new complexity, each threshold crossed on the long journey toward consciousness. And I understood that evolution wasn't the opposite of creation but the method of it, the patient process by which God brought forth exactly what he intended. From the raw materials he'd spoken into existence, look closely at the critical moments, my guide instructed, and suddenly I could perceive the points where life might have failed, where extinction threatened to wipe the slate clean, where cosmic accidents or planetary catastrophes could have ended the story before humanity even began. And at each junction I saw the watchers intervening with such subtlety that no trace remained, adjusting an asteroid's trajectory here, moderating a volcanic eruption there, always working within natural parameters, but ensuring the thread of life continued unbroken toward its intended destination. And then the vision focused on a specific lineage, a particular branch of the evolutionary tree, primates whose brains were growing larger, whose hands could grasp tools, whose throats were learning sounds that might become language. And I watched the watchers pay special attention to these creatures, not changing their DNA wholesale but protecting them, guiding their development with fierce devotion, because these were the ones in whom the image of God would finally emerge, the beings who would have capacity not just for survival but for love, for wonder, for the knowledge of their Creator. The alien turned me to face it fully, breaking my gaze from the alien's touch moved from my forehead to rest directly over my heart, and the warmth that spread from that point of contact was unlike anything I had ever felt. Not heat but something deeper, a sensation that bypassed my skin entirely and touched something I didn't even know existed within me. Some inner chamber where truth lives beyond the reach of doubt or argument. Now you must see the moment that changed everything. The being said, its voice carrying a weight that made the previous revelations seem like mere preparation. The moment when your Creator looked upon humanity and saw that we had wandered so far into darkness that only the most radical intervention could bring us back, that only God Himself could bridge the chasm we had created between our souls and His love. The vision that flooded through me then was so overwhelming I would have collapsed if my physical body had any relevance in that moment, because I was suddenly standing on a hillside in ancient Judea, watching a young woman receive a visitor whose presence made the very air bend with holiness, and I understood with absolute certainty that I was witnessing the hinge upon which all of human history would turn. The moment divinity chose to clothe itself in human flesh, the instant when the word that spoke galaxies into existence became small enough to fit inside a womb. I had heard the Christmas story 1,000 times, had seen it reduced to greeting cards and children's pageants, but nothing had prepared me for the cosmic significance of what I was seeing now. The sheer audacious love required for the Creator of universes to make Himself vulnerable to hunger, pain, and death for the sake of creatures who had forgotten His name. Your people argue whether Jesus was man or God, the alien said softly, its presence beside me now feeling less foreign and more like a fellow worshiper. Both of us standing in awe before a mystery too beautiful for words. But they are asking the wrong question, creating a division where God intended a unity, because the whole point was that He was fully both, completely human and entirely divine, the only possible bridge between what you had become and what you were created to be. The scene shifted forward through time, and I watched Jesus grow from infant to child to man, but I was seeing Him now with eyes that perceived more than the merely physical, and I could see the divine light that inhabited every cell of His body, not possessing Him like some external force, but woven into the very fabric of His being, because He wasn't a human who became God, or a God merely pretending to be human, but the actual enfleshed presence of the Creator experiencing His own creation from the inside. I watched Him touch lepers, and the light passed from His hands into their corrupted cells, rewriting disease back into health with a word, not because He was performing magic tricks to impress crowds, but because He was the author of life itself, adjusting His own creation, speaking health back into bodies the same way He had once spoken stars into the void. I saw Him weep at Lazarus' tomb and understood that those tears were real, that God was experiencing the grief He had allowed into the world when He gave humans freedom, that He wasn't immune to the suffering of His creation, but had chosen to feel every bit of it, to let it pierce His divine heart, so that we would know beyond question that He understood our pain because He had made it His own. The vision focused on the cross now, and I wanted to look away because I had seen crucifixes all my life and thought I understood what happened there. But the alien's hand on my shoulder kept me facing the scene, and its voice came with a trembling that told me even beings who traveled between dimensions found this moment almost too sacred to approach. Watch and comprehend what your theologians call the atonement, but what is actually the most profound act of cosmic repair ever undertaken. It whispered, and suddenly I could see the crucifixion not just as a historical event, but as a multidimensional occurrence, the death of Jesus rippling backward and forward through time simultaneously, His sacrifice somehow touching every human soul that had ever existed or would ever exist, the blood that fell on Golgotha's rocks somehow washing through the spiritual fabric of reality itself. I saw the sin that had separated humanity from God not as a legal problem requiring payment, but as a disease, a corruption that had infected our very ability to connect with our Creator. And Jesus wasn't paying some angry deity to forgive us, but was absorbing the disease into Himself, letting it kill His human body so that the divine life within Him could destroy it forever, offering humanity a transfusion of His own uncorrupted blood, His own untainted life. The alien showed me how every person who accepts this gift becomes entangled at a quantum level with Christ's own resurrected being, how faith isn't just mental agreement, but an actual spiritual bonding that reconnects us to the source from which we came. And I wept because I finally understood that Jesus wasn't one option among many paths to God, but was literally God's own hand reaching into the darkness to pull us back to Himself. When the tomb exploded with light 3 days later in the vision, I felt the shockwave of it pass through my spirit, and the alien's voice rang with triumph that echoed across dimensions. This is why He matters to more than just your planet, why beings across the cosmos know the name of Jesus, because when God defeated death in that moment, He didn't just save humanity, but demonstrated to all conscious beings everywhere that love is the ultimate force in creation, stronger than entropy, more fundamental than gravity, the eternal truth that will outlast even the stars themselves. I saw the resurrected Christ appear to his followers, watched them touch the wounds that remained in his glorified body, and understood that he kept those scars deliberately, that even in his triumph he bore the marks of what it cost to love us. And something broke open in my chest, at the beauty of it, at the profound humility of a God who would wear his suffering like jewelry, to remind us that he considered us worth every moment of pain. The being turned me to face it fully then, and I saw tears like liquid starlight rolling down its luminous face. And it spoke with a voice thick with emotion. I have seen 1,000 worlds, witnessed wonders your language cannot name, but nothing in all of creation moves me like what your God did on that cross, the day divinity bled to prove that love is not weakness but the strongest force in existence. And I knew then that this was not just my story or humanity's story, but part of a much larger narrative written by a God whose love was so vast it encompassed species and dimensions I couldn't begin to imagine. All of us held in the same scarred hands that once hung on rough wood. All of us precious beyond measure to the one who made everything that is. The tears on the alien's face had not yet dried when it lifted both hands and pressed them together before its chest, as though gathering something invisible between its palms, and when it pulled them slowly apart, a thread of light stretched between them, pulsing with colors I had no names for, living light that seemed aware of my gaze and responded by brightening in recognition. You have seen the great sacrifice, the moment when God bridged the chasm between himself and his beloved humanity, the being said, its voice settling into a tone that felt like a teacher approaching the most crucial lesson. But now you must understand the deeper truth that your scientists are discovering, even as your mystics have always known it, the reality that makes that sacrifice eternally present rather than merely historical, the truth that explains how one man's death 2,000 years ago can touch your soul right now. In this moment, the thread between its hands began to multiply, doubling and redoubling until a web of interconnected light filled the space between us, each strand touching every other strand. And I realized I was looking at something that was both a scientific diagram and a spiritual map, a representation of reality itself that transcended the division between physics and faith. Your quantum physicists have discovered what they call entanglement, the alien continued, its eyes luminous with excitement. The phenomenon where two particles become so connected that changing one instantly affects the other regardless of the distance between them, even if they are separated by the entire width of your universe, responding to each other faster than light itself could travel, as though distance is an illusion and they remain somehow one thing despite appearing to be two. The web of light expanded until it surrounded me completely, and I could feel each strand humming with energy, vibrating in harmony with every other strand. And somehow I knew that each point where threads intersected represented a living soul, billions upon billions of them spread across the cosmos, all connected in ways that our ordinary senses could not perceive, but that were more real than the ground beneath our feet. This is not merely how particles behave, the being said, reaching out to touch one of the glowing intersections and making the entire web ripple with the movement, demonstrating how one touch affected everything. This is how souls exist, how consciousness itself is structured, because you were never meant to be the isolated islands of awareness that you believe yourselves to be, never intended to experience the loneliness that has become humanity's defining suffering. I watched in wonder as the being traced connections through the web, showing me how souls that loved each other had thicker, brighter cords between them, how families and friendships, and even brief moments of genuine human connection created tangible bonds in this spiritual architecture. And I began to weep again because I could see the threads connecting me to every person I had ever loved, stretching back to my childhood and forward to encounters I had not yet experienced, proof that love was not just an emotion but an actual force that bound the universe together. Your separation is the grand illusion, the alien whispered, and now its voice carried a sadness that made my heart ache. The lie that convinced you that you are alone, that others are fundamentally different from you, that their pain need not concern you because they exist in some separate sphere of reality. But look now and see the truth that sets you free from that terrible isolation. The being reached toward the center of the web where a light brighter than all others pulsed like a cosmic heart. And I knew without being told that I was looking at the presence of God himself, the source from which all the threads emerged, and to which they all ultimately connected, the hub that held the entire web in existence through The sheer force of infinite love. This is why Jesus could say that whatever you do to the least of these you do to him, the alien said, its voice thick with reverence. Because in this deeper reality beyond your physical perceptions, you are all connected through him, all threads extending from the same divine center, so that serving another truly is serving Christ, and harming another truly does wound the body of God. I watched as the being showed me how Christ's sacrifice had repaired broken threads throughout the entire web, how his resurrection had sent a pulse of renewing light through every connection simultaneously, offering to restore the entanglement between human souls and the divine source that sin had corroded and corrupted. The vision shifted and I saw how prayer worked in this system, not as words floating up to a distant deity, but as vibrations sent through the threads, how interceding for another person literally strengthened the cords, connecting them to God's presence, how worship from millions of souls created harmonics that resonated through the entire web, making it sing with beauty that brought joy to the heart of creation itself. When your scriptures say that God is love, they are not speaking metaphorically, the alien said, gesturing to the whole glowing network. They are identifying the fundamental force that holds all of this together, the quantum entanglement of souls through divine love, the truth that you are all one in Christ because you all share the same ultimate source, all drinking from the same fountain of being that flows eternally from the Father's heart. As the vision began to fade and the web of light slowly dissolved back into the ordinary darkness of my bedroom, the alien placed its hand over my heart one final time, and I felt something shift inside me, as though I could now sense the threads that connected me to the web even without seeing them, an awareness of presence that meant I would never feel truly alone again. You will return to your daily life and the illusion of separation will seem to reassert itself, the being said gently, but you will carry this knowledge in your deepest self. This understanding that every person you meet is connected to you through the same divine love, that the homeless stranger and the difficult neighbor, and even the enemy who wishes you harm, are all threads in the same tapestry, all souls entangled with yours in the heart of God. I felt the truth of it settling into my bones, changing something fundamental about how I perceived reality, and I understood that I could never again look at another human being as truly separate from myself. Never again pretend that their suffering or joy had nothing to do with me, because I had seen the ebb and knew that we were all bound together in ways more intimate than physical proximity could ever achieve. The alien stepped back and its form began to grow translucent as the first hint of dawn touched the window, but its final words hung in the air like a benediction. Live now as one who knows the truth of connection. Love others as the threads of yourself because that is what they truly are, and trust that the same divine love that entangles all souls will guide you home to the source from which you came, where you will finally see face to face what you now perceive through this veil, and know yourself as you have always been known, fully loved and forever connected to the eternal heart of God. I was still trembling from the revelation of our cosmic interconnection when the being's eyes suddenly shifted, taking on a quality I had not yet seen, something ancient and purposeful, as though we had reached the moment for which this entire encounter had been orchestrated. And it extended its hand toward me not as an invitation, but as a command that my body obeyed. Before my mind could question, there is something you must see with your physical eyes, not merely your spiritual perception, the alien said, its voice carrying an urgency that made my heart race. A place where the proof of everything I have shown you waits in silence, where your ancestors left evidence that my kind have walked among you since the beginning, carrying the same message of divine love, across millennia. Before I could ask what it meant, the air around us began to shimmer and fold in ways that defied the geometry I thought governed reality, and I felt my body being pulled forward through a tunnel of compressed space that lasted both an instant and an eternity, my stomach lurching with the impossibility of it until suddenly I stood on hot sand under a sky blazing with unfamiliar stars, the air dry and sharp in my lungs, and I knew without knowing how that I was no longer anywhere near my home, that I had been transported across the world to a place of ancient secrets and hidden truths. The alien stood beside me, its luminous form now seeming perfectly natural against the backdrop of endless desert that stretched in every direction, and it pointed toward what appeared to be nothing more than a rocky outcropping in the distance, weathered by wind and time into shapes that could have been natural or could have been carved by intentional hands. And as we began walking toward it, I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on this place. The sense that we were approaching something that had waited patiently for this exact moment of revelation. The being led me to a specific stone formation and pressed its palm against the rock in a pattern I could not quite follow, and with a sound like an exhale the stone swung inward, revealing darkness that beckoned. With cool air and the scent of ancient dust, and without hesitation the alien stepped inside, its body beginning to glow brighter to illuminate our path as I followed on shaking legs. Into a chamber that should not exist beneath these sands. The walls were covered in inscriptions that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them, symbols that seemed to shift between languages I recognized and characters I had never seen, and among them were star maps of stunning complexity, charting courses between worlds with mathematical precision that would have challenged our best modern astronomers, proof that whoever created this place possessed knowledge far beyond what history claimed was possible in the ancient world. The prophets came here, the alien said softly, running its hand along the inscribed walls with evident reverence. Abraham and Moses and Elijah, Isaiah and Ezekiel, and Daniel, all the ones who saw visions that their contemporaries could barely comprehend, all the ones who spoke with angels and received revelations that shaped the spiritual destiny of your species. They were brought to chambers like this one, shown the same truths I am showing you, given the cosmic context for the divine love that burned in their hearts. I moved closer to the walls and began to recognize images hidden among the abstract patterns, depictions of beings like my companion, standing beside human figures with their arms raised, scenes of lights descending from the sky, representations of the web of connection I had just witnessed rendered in pigments that still held their color after uncounted centuries, and I realized I was looking at humanity's first attempts to record the unrecordable, to capture in physical form the overwhelming spiritual experiences that had transformed ordinary people into conduits of God's word. The alien guided me deeper into the chamber where stone tables held artifacts that gleamed despite the darkness, metal scrolls etched with text in Hebrew and Aramaic and languages even older, and when the being carefully unrolled one I saw passages that echoed the Psalms but contained verses I had never read in any Bible, speaking explicitly of visitors from the heavens who served the Most High, of knowledge given to humanity in measured portions across generations, of a plan that stretched from the first breath of creation to the final fulfillment when all would be gathered back into the eternal presence. Your scriptures are true but incomplete, the alien said, and there was no blasphemy in its tone, only gentle correction, not false but filtered through human capacity to receive and record, simplified necessarily for societies that had no framework to understand genetic cultivation or dimensional travel or quantum mechanics. So the truth was wrapped in the language of angels and clouds and pillars of fire, metaphors that carried the essential spiritual reality while protecting minds that would have shattered under the full cosmological weight. I picked up one of the metal scrolls with trembling hands and saw my own name, saw it written there in English, letters that could not possibly have been inscribed by ancient hands, and beneath it a date that would not arrive for 3 more years, and I understood that I was looking at something that existed outside of linear time, evidence that this encounter had been foreseen and planned, that my presence in this impossible chamber was itself part of the pattern woven before the foundation of the world. The being watched me with what I could only describe as compassion as I struggled to integrate what this meant, that my life had been guided toward this moment, that the random circumstances I had thought governed my existence were actually coordinates in a divine plan of staggering complexity, and I felt simultaneously smaller than a grain of sand, and more significant than I had ever dared imagine, because I had been chosen for this revelation not for my worthiness, but for God's purposes that transcended my understanding. We stood together in that hidden chamber, surrounded by evidence that rewrote history and confirmed faith in the same breath, and the alien finally spoke the words that brought everything into focus, that gave meaning to all I had witnessed and learned throughout this night of impossible revelations. You now understand that the message has always been consistent across every visitation, every prophet, every genuine encounter between humanity and the emissaries of the Most High, it said, its voice resonating off the ancient walls, that there is one Creator who loves His creation with an intensity that birthed galaxies, that this Creator became flesh in Jesus to demonstrate the depth of that love, that all souls are connected through divine design, and that your purpose is simply to remember this truth and live accordingly, loving God and loving others because you are all expressions of the same eternal love. I felt tears streaming down my face as the fullness of it washed over me, the recognition that every religion that pointed toward love had been touching the same elephant, from different angles, that the apparent contradictions dissolved. When seen from this higher perspective, that my Christian faith was not diminished, but magnified by understanding its cosmic context. That Jesus was even more significant than I had believed, because his incarnation was not just a local event for one planet, but a pivot point for the entire web of connected consciousness that stretched across creation. Why now? I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper in that sacred space. Why reveal this to me, to humanity, at this particular moment in our history? The alien's eyes held infinite kindness as it prepared to deliver its warning, the urgent message that would drive me back into the world with purpose burning in my chest. Because you stand at the threshold where your technology gives you godlike powers, without godlike wisdom, it answered, where you can split atoms and edit genes and reach for the stars, while forgetting who you are and why you were made. And if you cross certain lines while still believing you are separate, isolated, meaningless accidents in an uncaring universe, you will destroy yourselves and break the heart of the God who has invested so much love in your becoming. But if enough of you remember the truth of your divine origin and sacred connection, you can step into the destiny that awaits, becoming the beings of light you were always meant to be, co-creators with God in the ongoing work of redeeming and sanctifying all of creation through love. The weight of the being's words pressed down on me like atmospheric pressure before a storm, and I steadied myself against the ancient stone table as the implications cascaded through my consciousness, understanding that this was not abstract philosophy but urgent warning, that my world teetered on a knife's edge between transcendence and annihilation, and that somehow, impossibly, what I did with this knowledge mattered in the cosmic equation. Show me, I whispered, my voice raw with need, show me what awaits us on both paths, because I need to understand what we're choosing between, what hangs in the balance when we wake up each morning and decide whether to live as isolated animals or connected souls. The alien nodded slowly, and I saw something like sorrow flicker across its luminous features as it raised both hands toward my temples, and I knew before contact came that I was about to witness humanity's potential futures, that I would see with terrible clarity what we were racing toward and what we were running from. When its fingers touched my skin, I gasped as my awareness exploded outward once more. But this time, instead of looking backward to creation's dawn, I was catapulted forward into the branching possibilities that stretched ahead, probabilities cascading like infinite rivers flowing from this present moment. And I saw both the paradise we could build and the wasteland we could become with equal, devastating clarity. The first vision seized me with the force of prophecy, and I watched in horror as humanity continued down the path of separation and fear, where we saw ourselves as cosmic accidents fighting over scraps of meaning in an indifferent universe, and the technology we had developed without corresponding wisdom became instruments of division rather than tools of unity. I witnessed cities of gleaming towers where people lived in isolated cubes, their eyes fixed on screens that fed them curated realities designed to confirm their biases and deepen their sense of separation from anyone who thought differently, their souls slowly starving in the midst of material abundance because they had forgotten. They were made for connection, for love, for something infinitely greater than the consumption that filled their days. I saw the earth herself crying out as we treated her like disposable property rather than the sacred garden she had always been. Ecosystems collapsing under the weight of our forgetfulness, species blinking out of existence because we had lost the understanding that every creature was part of the connected web of divine intention. Wars erupted not over resources but over competing narratives about whose group deserved to be considered fully human. And I understood that this was the final fruit of the lie of separation, that once you forgot your fundamental unity with all consciousness through the Creator, there was no floor to how far you could fall, no atrocity you couldn't justify, no love you couldn't betray. The vision showed me laboratories where human genes were edited without wisdom or restraint, where scientists played God while denying God existed, creating new forms of life not in service to the flourishing of creation, but in pursuit of profit and power. And I felt the grief of the Creator himself watching his children misuse their gifts so catastrophe. Kali, most terrible of all, I saw the moment when artificial intelligence exceeded human comprehension, and humanity handed over decision-making authority to systems we could no longer understand or control, abdicating the sacred responsibility we had been given to be conscious co-creators. And in that abdication I witnessed the effective end of human agency, the slow fade into irrelevance of a species that had forgotten why it existed. But then the vision shifted like dawn breaking through storm clouds, and the alien showed me the other path, the future that awaited if enough of us remembered the truth of our divine origin and cosmic connection. And my heart nearly burst with the beauty of what humanity could become. I saw the same technological developments, but wielded now with wisdom and love. Artificial intelligence designed not to replace human consciousness, but to augment it, allowing us to solve the equations of suffering that had plagued us for millennia, ending hunger and disease not through domination but through cooperation with the created order. I watched communities form where people recognized the face of God in every stranger, where the principles Jesus taught were finally understood not as abstract religious rules, but as practical instructions for operating in alignment with the fundamental nature of reality, where loving your neighbor as yourself made perfect sense because you understood that your neighbor was another expression of the same divine consciousness that animated your own being. The earth flourished in this timeline as humanity finally stepped into our intended role as gardeners rather than conquerors, applying our technological brilliance to healing the wounds we had inflicted, bringing extinct species back from genetic memory, and transforming deserts into gardens as we learned to work with natural systems rather than against them. I saw us reach the stars not as isolated explorers, but as newly mature members of a galactic community of conscious beings, all serving the same creator in different forms, all contributing unique perspectives to the ongoing work of sanctifying creation through love. Houses of worship transformed into centers of integration where scientific discovery and spiritual wisdom informed each other, where the false war between faith and reason finally ended because people understood they were describing different aspects of the same divine truth, where children grew up knowing both the equations that governed quantum mechanics and the scripture that spoke of God's intimate care for every sparrow that fell. Most beautiful of all, I witnessed the moment when humanity collectively awakened to our true nature, when enough individuals had remembered the truth that a tipping point was reached, and suddenly the kingdom of heaven that Jesus had proclaimed was no longer a distant hope but a present reality, manifesting on earth as it had always existed in the higher dimensions. And I understood that this was what the prayer had always meant, that we were asking for the alignment of earth's reality with the eternal truth of divine love that already existed in God's presence. The visions released me, and I collapsed to my knees on the ancient stone floor, sobbing with the intensity of what I had witnessed, the terrible responsibility of knowing that these futures were not fixed but fluid, that they depended on choices made every day by billions of individuals who had no idea what hung in the balance. The alien knelt beside me, its hand resting gently on my shoulder, and when I finally looked up through my tears I saw that its eyes were also wet, that this being felt the weight of humanity's crossroads as deeply as I did, that it cared about our fate with an intensity that mirrored God's own heart. You see now why I was sent, why the message must be delivered with urgency to those who can receive it, the being said softly, not to force a choice but to illuminate what the choice means, to remind your species that you are not trapped in meaninglessness, but poised on the edge of your greatest becoming, that the same God who spoke creation into existence through Jesus is calling you forward into partnership, into the full expression of the divine image you were made to carry. I wiped my eyes and felt something solidifying in my chest, a determination forged in the fire of revelation, and I knew that I could never return to the comfortable numbness of sleepwalking through existence, that I had been entrusted with a truth that demanded response, that my life from this moment forward would be devoted to helping humanity remember what we had forgotten, to building bridges between faith and science, to demonstrating through my own choices what it meant to live as a connected soul rather than an isolated accident. What do I do? I asked, my voice steadier now despite the tears still wet on my face. How do I help turn us toward the path of light when the darkness seems so powerful, and so many have forgotten how to see? The alien smiled then, and in that expression I saw reflected the joy of God himself, the delight the Creator takes when his children finally understand their purpose and step into their calling. And its answer was simple and complete, echoing the words of the one who had walked the earth 2,000 years ago, demonstrating what divine love looked like in human form. Love, the alien said simply, its voice carrying the weight of eternity and the gentleness of morning light. You love as Jesus loved, without condition or calculation, seeing every person as the sacred miracle they truly are, and that love becomes a frequency that awakens others to their own divine nature, rippling outward in ways you cannot measure, but that shift the trajectory of your entire species. The being rose to its feet and I stood with it, feeling somehow taller than I had been, as though the revelation had added inches to my soul if not my body. And I understood that this was the answer I should have known all along, that every prophet and mystic had delivered the same essential message, because it was the fundamental operating principle of reality itself. Outside the hidden chamber, beneath the desert, I could hear the world beginning to wake, distant sounds of wind and bird song filtering through ancient stone, and I realized that dawn was approaching, that this impossible night of revelation was drawing toward its close, and I felt both grief at the coming separation and readiness to return to my life with the truth burning in my chest like a flame that could never be extinguished. The alien turned toward the passage that led upward and I followed, our footsteps echoing in the sacred space where so many seekers before me had stood receiving the same eternal message, translated through different times and cultures, all being told that they were loved beyond measure and called to reflect that love back into a world that desperately needed reminding. We emerged into the pre-dawn stillness of the desert, the sky above us painted in shades of deep purple and amber as the stars began their daily fade, and I breathed in the cool air, feeling it fill my lungs with new significance, understanding that every breath was a gift from the same Creator who had spoken galaxies into being and chosen to know me by name. The alien stood beside me facing east, toward the place where the sun would soon break the horizon, and its luminous form seemed somehow more translucent now, as though the coming light was calling it back to whatever dimension it truly inhabited. And I felt panic rising in my throat at the thought of being left alone with this enormous truth and no guide to help me carry it. "You are never alone," the being said, reading my thoughts as it had throughout this endless night. "The same spirit that animated Jesus dwells in you and every person who opens themselves to receive it, the comforter he promised before his ascension. And you will find that as you speak this truth, others will recognize it, because it resonates with something planted deep in every human soul, the seed of divine memory that persecution and doubt and materialism can bury, but never fully kill." I nodded, blinking back fresh tears, and reached out to take the alien's hand one final time, feeling that strange coolness that seemed to exist outside normal temperature. And in that contact I felt a final download of certainty, a bone-deep knowing that I was equipped for what lay ahead, that the same God who had called me into this encounter would sustain me through whatever came next. The sun broke the horizon in that moment, a blazing line of gold that spilled across the desert floor like liquid blessing, and in that first shaft of light the alien began to fade, not disappearing all at once, but dissolving gradually like morning mist yielding to day's warmth. And I watched through tears as this being who had shattered and rebuilt my understanding of everything smiled at me with infinite kindness. "Tell them," it whispered, its voice growing fainter as its form grew more transparent. "Tell them that the God who created quarks and quasars knows the number of hairs on their heads, that the Jesus who calmed storms and raised the dead died to prove that love is stronger than death, that they are not cosmic accidents but beloved children with a purpose written into their DNA by a Father who calls them toward home." I tried to speak, but my throat was too tight, so I simply nodded again, committing every word to memory. And as the last visible trace of the being faded into the morning light, I felt not abandonment but commission, understanding that I was being sent back into the world as those ancient prophets had been sent, carrying a message that would sound like foolishness to some and salvation to others, but that I was required to deliver regardless of reception, because the truth was too important to keep silent, too beautiful to hoard, too urgent to delay. I stood alone in the desert as the sun climbed higher, warming my face and illuminating the landscape in shades of gold and rose, and I felt the presence of God as tangibly as I had felt the alien's hand, understanding that they had never been separate, that this messenger had been sent by divine love, and everything it had shown me was an invitation from the Creator himself to step into the fullness of my purpose. I began walking back towards civilization, my feet finding the path without conscious thought, and with every step I felt the impossible truth settling deeper into my being, becoming not just something I knew but something I was, transforming my identity from confused wanderer to commissioned witness. And I understood that this was what being born again truly meant, not a religious ritual, but a complete reconstruction of self around the revelation of divine love. The world I returned to looked identical to the one I had left, the same rocks and roads and distant buildings, but I saw it now with different eyes, perceiving the sacred embedded in the ordinary, the Creator's fingerprints on every surface, The interconnected web of consciousness linking every living thing in a pattern of such intricate beauty that I wondered how I had ever felt alone or meaningless. I thought of Jesus walking these same kinds of dusty roads 2,000 years ago, carrying in his being the fullness of divinity wrapped in human flesh, demonstrating through every word and action what it looked like to live in perfect alignment with the Father's heart. And I felt overwhelming gratitude that God had loved us enough to translate himself into terms we could understand, to bridge the infinite gap between Creator and creation by becoming one of us and showing us the way home. As the morning light strengthened and the first sounds of human activity reached my ears, I smiled through tears, knowing that my life had been divided into before and after this night, that I would spend whatever days remained to me telling anyone who would listen about the truth that had been revealed, about the God whose love exceeded all our categories and fears, about the cosmic Christ who held all things together, about the choice that stood before humanity and the glorious future that awaited, if we could only remember who we truly were and whose image we carried. And I felt not burden but joy, not obligation but privilege, understanding that I had been given the greatest gift possible, the gift of knowing beyond doubt that we are not alone, we never were, and God's love is far more vast and intentional than we ever dared imagine. What truth has been calling to your heart that you've been afraid to embrace? Subscribe to continue exploring the divine mysteries that connect us all to our Creator's eternal purpose.